Friends, come in. Come in. Come into this place, which we make holy by our presence. Come in with all your vulnerabilities and your strengths, and your fears and anxieties and loves and hopes. For here you need not hide, nor pretend, nor be anything other than who you are and who you're called to be. Come into this place where the ordinary is sanctified and the human is celebrated, the compassionate is expected. Come into this place. Together we make it a holy place. Can I tell you a story? This is a long ago story. This is longer before the year zero than the year zero is before us. This is long enough ago that there wasn't spinach or broccoli or apples yet in the world. This is long enough ago that there was no such thing as coins or scissors or glass, before people rode horses, before the woolly mammoth had gone extinct. It was a small and isolated population, but still, it's a while back. This is the oldest story we know that was ever written down. This was only 1,000 years after writing had even been invented. It starts like this: Sanagba Imru. I don't actually know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because the last person to speak it died 4 millennia ago. But it means Sanagba Imru, the person who saw the abyss. In this story, that person's name is Gilgamesh, and he stands 17 feet tall and 8 feet wide and was king in Uruk, this great walled city, the biggest city in the world, the biggest city that had ever existed then. He was the most powerful king, but an evil king. Day and night, the story says, he oppressed the weak. He does not let the young woman go to her mother, the girl to the warrior, the bride to the young groom. So the people of Uruk call out to the gods, and especially to the goddess, the great goddess called the Mother, the great lady who hears them and goes into the wilderness and takes a pinch of clay off the ground and shapes it into a man and breathes life into him. The story says she gave birth in darkness and silence to one like the war god. Enkidu was his name. Enkidu, who knew neither people nor homeland, who fed with the gazelles on grass. With wild animals, he drank at water holes. With hurrying animals, his heart grew light. And Enkidu comes into the city of Uruk. And as soon as Gilgamesh sees him, they fight. They fight in every part of the city. They fight, they wrestle, they struggle together from sunrise all the way through the long hours of the day until sunset. When Gilgamesh finally pins Enkidu down, Gilgamesh shaped his mouth to speak in that moment, not in anger, not in victory, not in violence, but in praise. To praise Enkidu, saying, "Who is like you? You have no match. Let me cease from oppressing my people and let us be friends." Enkidu stood there listening to his words, growing pale, and Enkidu sat down weeping. His eyes filled with tears, his arms went slack, his strength left him, and they seized one another, embracing, taking one another's hand like brothers. And Enkidu spoke words to Gilgamesh, the first words he'd ever spoken. Friend. Friend. You've heard the first part of the story of Gilgamesh, the evil king tamed by the wild man, Enkidu. Let me tell you the rest. Gilgamesh and Enkidu were heroes together, But now, after so many adventures, Enkidu lay dying, cursed by the goddess Ishtar. And as he lay sick in bed, Enkidu woke to tell his friend Gilgamesh the dream he had had. He said, "In my dream, I saw a man with a face like a demon. The paws of a lion were his paws. The talons of an eagle were his talons. He overpowered me and bore me down. He seized me and led me down to the house of darkness, the house of Urkala, the house where one who goes in never comes out again. The house that if one lives there, one never sees light. The place where they live on dust and their food is mud. Their clothes are like birds' clothes, a garment of wings. And they see no light, living in blackness. And on the door and the door bolt, deeply settled dust." This is the Babylonian afterlife, to live in a dry land of silent, lightless forever. And Enkidu lay dying for 6 days, and on the 7th night he died, and the lamentations of Gilgamesh filled the city. The meadows weep. The meadows mourn you like your mother. The wild bull and the ibex, all the animals of the plain cry for you. The river on whose banks you walked laments you. "An evil," said Gilgamesh, "an evil has risen up and robbed me. My friend, my companion of so many adventures, is dead." Did you ever have the experience in childhood of feeling this nameless fear that chased you, maybe like coming up out of the empty basement? It felt like, oh my God, something is... The sheer and total terror that paralyzes the mind and gusts over you and holds you and absorbs you. That terror, like a living thing, comes into the presence of Gilgamesh. And he runs, he tears off his fine clothes, and he puts on animal skins, and he pulls the curls out of his hair, the braids, and he runs over the hills. And he passes into the mountain, whose entrance is guarded by scorpion people, and then beyond into the darkness under the mountain. He travels 12 double hours in the blackness without sound or sight, feeling the weight of darkness pushing in around him, until at last he emerges and comes to the edge of the great ocean and the waters of death. And at each stage in this journey, at every step of this process, those who guard the gates along the way, they ask him, "Why is your strength wasted and your face sunken? Why has evil fortune done in your looks? There is sorrow in your belly, and your face is like that of a man who's gone on a long journey. Your face is weathered by cold and heat, and you are roaming the wilderness," they tell him, "in search of a wind puff." And to each of these gatekeepers, Gilgamesh answers, "It's not that my strength is wasted, my face is sunken. It's not that evil fortune has entered my heart. It's not the sorrow in my belly. It's not that I look like a man who's been on a long journey. It's not that cold and heat have weathered my features. I do not roam the wilderness in quest of a wind puff, a thing that can never be found. But because my friend, my companion, Enkidu, because of him, we overcame everything. We climbed the mountain together. We captured the bull of heaven and slew him. We killed Humbaba, the demon who lived in the cedar forest. Together we entered the gate of the mountains and killed the man-eating lions. My friend whom I love dearly, who with me underwent all hardships, and Enkidu, who I love, is gone from me. And when he died, I wept over him for 6 days. And on the seventh night, in fear of death, I roam the wilderness. The case of Enkidu lies heavy on me. On a long journey, I wander the steppe. How can I keep still? How can I keep silent? The friend I loved has turned to clay. The boatman carries Gilgamesh across the sea into the far country where the source of all rivers is. And here at the source of all rivers are the two people Gilgamesh has been looking for this whole time, Utnapishtim and his wife. Utnapishtim and his wife, who are the only humans with eternal life, who survived the great flood. Utnapishtim says, yes, we do have eternal life, and yes, I can give you this gift from the gods if you can stay awake an entire week, which is maybe an honest challenge, and maybe is a cruel trick because it's not possible, or maybe is the work of a wise teacher who knew that Gilgamesh had to experience the impossible task and fail. A day passes and another, but eventually he sleeps. Gilgamesh is human. He too will die. And Utnapishtim gives him a sort of a consolation prize, a plant to restore youthfulness, the plant that makes old men young again. But while Gilgamesh sleeps, a snake comes by and eats it. So he returns. The boatman who'd brought him across the sea takes him to a washing place, and he cleans his filthy body. He casts off the skin and carries them to the sea. He braids his hair again and puts on clean robes and returns to his city and walks the rest of the way down his road. He returns back across the ocean, back across the desert, over the mountains, back to the city of Uruk, where he is king, and inscribes his story on tablets for all to read, and rules again as king. Do we build a house forever? The story asks in the end. Do we build a house forever? Do we seal a contract for all time? Does hostility last forever between enemies? Does the river rise forever higher? From the beginning, there is no permanence. The man as he was in the beginning and the hero, are they not the same? The assembly of the great gods sets the end of things. They settle life and death. And as for death, its time is hidden. The time of life is shown plain. And that's it. That's the whole of it. 4,000 years gone and more. The author, John Gardner, apparently said that there are only two stories in the world. You go on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. Hansel and Gretel go on a journey, Godzilla comes to town. Luke Skywalker goes on a journey, Mary Poppins comes to town. You get the pattern. Every plot is one of these two. The oldest story, the oldest written story in the world, Gilgamesh, is journey and return. Out he goes into the far country, to the source of all rivers, only to find that his own death is inevitable. And when he learns this once and for all, and the truth of it sinks into the soles of his feet, he doesn't pretend that it didn't happen. He doesn't go mad. He doesn't renounce the world and become an ascetic. He doesn't even mourn at that point. He bathes and puts on clean clothes and returns to his life again. He returns and he tells the story. He tells the whole story in all its grief, in its failure, and all the generations between then and now have not tacked on a happy ending. He doesn't in the end even disavow his terrible tyrannical rule, which precipitates the whole story at the beginning. He tells this story and it's weird and alien and morally ambiguous. I told this the kids were here at the 9:00 service this morning after camping out in the church last night. And I told them we could have introduced the story by saying, kids, here is a weird old story that does not make sense. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not really named the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's what people called it in the 19th century when it was rediscovered by a British translator working through cuneiform tablets who, hearing the story of Utnapishtim, who had survived the flood, thought that he had found independent verification that the biblical account of the flood was true, and was so excited by the fact that he found this is a true story, that he tore off all of his clothes and ran out of the library that he was in. I don't know if I have never been that excited about something, I guess. There's time. Not yet. But the Epic of Gilgamesh it's what people called it in the 19th century. It's what the translators called it. But in the ancient pre-Christian Near East, in the fragments of the story and the references to it, the name is Sanagba Imuru, those words that open it, which means the one who saw the abyss. And one translation of the opening lines renders it this way. It says, of him who knew the most all men know, who made the journey, heartbroken, reconciled, who knew the way things were before the flood, the secret things, the mystery, who went to the end of the earth and over, who returned and wrote the story on a tablet of stone. Heartbroken, reconciled. 250 generations since Gilgamesh was king in Uruk, and we have echoes of that same story in our lives too. Gilgamesh, passing through the darkness under the mountain, is us. His 12 double hours without sight or sound or sense are a map of the interior territory we all pass through sooner or later. It goes on. The narrative goes into such repetitive length. Gilgamesh entered the darkness alone, without a companion. By the time he reached the end of the first league, the darkness was total. Nothing before, nothing behind. He made his way companionless to the end of the second league, utterly lightless, black. There was nothing before or behind, nothing at all. Only the blackness pressed in on his body. He felt his way blind through the mountain tunnel, struggling for breath. Through the third league alone, companionless. Through the fourth, making his way, struggling for every breath, to the fifth. In the absolute dark, nothing before, nothing behind. The weight of the blackness pressing in on him. And he tried sometimes to cry out against the blackness, but it was utterly lightless. He was weeping and fearful, alone, without a companion. Just then, at the end of the 9th league, just once, the rough tongue of the north wind licked at his face, like the tongue of a wild bull or a lion, and he struggled on through the darkness, trying to breathe. Through 11 leagues of darkness, nothing at all, and something ahead of him, a league ahead, a little light, a grayness began to show. Weeping and fearful and struggling to breathe, he made his way through the last league of the journey, 12 leagues in darkness, alone, companionless, weeping and fearful, struggling to breathe. He made his way and finally struggled out into the morning air and the morning sunlight, emerged from the mountain into a wonderful garden, all the colors of the jewels of the world. And beyond the garden, Gilgamesh saw the sea. This is a map, not of a place that can be found in the world, but of each of our internal worlds. A story about a road you will travel or have traveled, or are traveling right now, trying to breathe in the darkness with nothing before and nothing behind, trying to cry out against the pressure of the weight of that blackness pressing in on you mile after mile until at last a little bit of grayness, weeping and fearful, struggling to breathe, you finally make it out into the morning air, the morning sunlight, the garden of the world again. Gilgamesh endures, I think, because it still tells us who we are. 40 centuries is a long time, but not long enough to change what it is to be human. Ignorance and fear and friendship, love and sex, so much sex, I skip most of that, and death, failure and despair, and the answerless silence of reality. And then at last, becoming alive in your life, heartbroken, reconciled. The story isn't about battling the demon Humbaba in the cedar forest. It's about becoming a person who has fought demons. The story isn't about sleeping with the priestess for 7 continuous days. I skipped that part earlier. It's an Enkidu thing. It's about becoming a person who has the sensual, embodied experience of pleasure. The story isn't about getting tricked by a snake. It's that losing the thing you've been looking for so long is a feature of being alive. The story isn't ultimately about a hero, but about us becoming persons among persons. It starts, after all, with Gilgamesh as a superman and ends with him as a man, still without his beloved friend, still going to suffer and die. And the material circumstances of the life he returns to in the end are just the same as when he left. He goes to sleep in the same bed, in the same house, in the same city, at the end of the story as the beginning. But the external circumstances aren't what the thing is about. The story is full of incident and adventure and excitement and battles and chases and quest and loss and sex. And while those are the story, it's about, I think, becoming a person fully engaged with the experience of being alive in the world. It's not about the strength of being a hero, but what it looks like to acquire wisdom, and the way the path to wisdom inevitably crosses through suffering. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't really about Gilgamesh at all. It's about you, us, like all great myths. Something true, even if it never happened. A map of the emotional and spiritual journey of living. We think that the point, says the Buddhist monk Pema Chodron, we think that the point of living is to pass the test or overcome the problem. But the truth is, she says, things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart again. Then they come together again and fall apart. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, for relief, for misery, room for joy. With Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh, overwhelmed by being human, tries not to be human anymore, tries to become immortal, tries to be a god. He tries to run, that is, from the reality of life. To run away, it's too painful. And only by running as far as a mythic hero can possibly do, can he discover there isn't somewhere else to run to. You're not called to become someone else. You're called to be the you who reckons with these realities, who sees the abyss and returns to life, heartbroken and reconciled. The poet Charles Bukowski says, you can't beat death. You can't beat death. But you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. That's our work 4,000 years later. The same old pilgrimage toward becoming human, failing and going on and halting and grieving and reaching out and falling and standing again and walking through the darkness under the mountain towards sunlight again. Not to beat death, but to beat death in life, journey and return, heartbroken, reconciled. Amen.